We start from this baseline principle that if the president is going to send our loved ones into harm's way, that we deserve for those decisions to be as deliberative and transparent and constitutional as possible.
That's the voice of Sarah Streyder, Executive Director of the Secure Families Initiative. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are today's co-hosts, Tom Collina and Alex Hall.
Welcome back to Press the Button. That new voice you just heard is Chase Enright, our new development coordinator in San Francisco. The dog days of summer feel officially over here in D.C., and there have been a number of developments in nuclear and national security news this past week, from reports that North Korea successfully launched a new long-range cruise missile to a new defense agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S.
Hi, Alex. Great to have you subbing in again for Michelle today. And last week, we also learned from a new book by journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. New details about how General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, tried to insert himself into the nuclear chain of command where he has no formal role. Milley did this because he was concerned, and in my view, rightly so, that after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, that President Trump was simply too unstable to be left alone with full authority to launch nuclear weapons. But as I wrote last week in Defense One, we need to focus on the dangerous policy that put the general in that impossible spot. And as our listeners know, we simply should not allow presidents to have unilateral power to start nuclear war. And we at Plowshares will be working to change this policy in the weeks ahead. But now, back to the show. And Alex, please tell us what you have in store for Early Warning.
On Early Warning, I sit down with Plowshares Fund's own president, Dr. Emma Belcher, to discuss this new defense deal between the US, UK, and Australia, known as AUKUS. This deal provides Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, and we'll be following this issue as it develops, so also stay tuned for more analysis by future guests.
And after that, I sit down with Sarah Streyder from the Secure Families Initiative to talk about the post-September 11th wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and their effects on veterans and military families. You know, most Americans simply don't see the impact of war on military families because we don't know anyone in the military. So Sarah and I sit down to talk about why this is and how she is helping military families to speak out and share their stories. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps us improve this show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Plowshares Fund's president, Dr. Emma Belcher. Thank you for joining. As you know, we have 7 minutes to discuss this week's nuclear and national security news, starting now. Last week, President Biden, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and Australia Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced a trilateral effort known as AUKUS to provide Australia with the ability to deploy nuclear-powered submarines. To start, why is this agreement such a big deal when it comes to nuclear weapons policy?
Well, thanks, Alex. And this issue really has many dimensions. There's big picture strategy, with China saying the agreement is Cold War-like behavior. There's diplomatic relations with France deeply unhappy, recalling its ambassadors to Washington and Canberra. Interestingly, not London, but I think that's for a different story. And also it's got the nuclear non-proliferation regime agenda. And there are so many angles of this to talk about. But given that we're limited on time, I'll just get straight to how it affects nuclear weapons because it really is of particular relevance for us here on Press the Button. And first, I do want to emphasize for our listeners that this is not about the US providing Australia with submarines that carry nuclear warheads. There's a big difference between nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear-armed submarines. And this distinction is really important, so bear with me. Nuclear-powered submarines have a small reactor on board that produces the power to operate the subs. This is called nuclear propulsion. Whereas nuclear-armed submarines are not necessarily nuclear-powered, although they can be, but these nuclear-armed submarines carry missiles that can deliver nuclear warheads to their intended targets. And what the US is proposing here is to share technology with Australia for nuclear-powered submarines. They are not providing Australia with nuclear weapons for their submarines. Nonetheless, on this technology sharing deal, experts are really concerned that this could weaken the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And the US has only ever shared this technology in the past with the UK, a country that already has nuclear weapons. And the US has had a long-standing policy of not sharing precisely this technology because of its highly sensitive nature and proliferation risk. And then the only other countries to have this technology are countries that also already have nuclear weapons. So that's the US, UK, France, China, Russia, and India. Now, the problem with providing this kind of technology to a country that does not have nuclear weapons is that it's what we call dual use. While this technology can be used to power submarines, it can also be used for nuclear weapons. And knowing what it's ultimately being used for is really difficult. Now, this dual use problem extends beyond the submarine or naval reactor issue, and it's really where the cornerstone agreement of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Regime comes into play. That's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. And countries that are party to the NPT are allowed to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, such as nuclear power and medical isotopes to treat cancer patients, for example. And their commitment is that they will use this for peaceful purposes and not use it for weapons. And this commitment is verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, through what's called safeguards. And the IAEA is responsible for safeguarding nuclear material in countries, making sure that it is truly used for peaceful purposes and is not diverted for weapons. Now, here's the clanger, though. That responsibility of the IAEA for oversight stops when it comes to the use of this technology in non-weapons military applications, which submarines are. And this is a clear loophole in the NPT. So let's say a country secretly wants to use material for weapons purposes. It could tell the IAEA it needs highly enriched uranium to fuel its submarines, take that material out of safeguards, thus ending IAEA oversight, and instead use that material for weapons purposes without the IAEA having any knowledge. And that's what people worry about with countries like Brazil and Iran, which have both explored developing nuclear-powered submarines that would use highly enriched uranium. And countries have vehemently opposed this because of the proliferation concern. But the US says it's not concerned about this with respect to its ally Australia, citing its impeccable non-proliferation record. And look, it's probably right. It's unlikely that Australia would use this technology to develop its own nuclear weapons, at least not in any foreseeable future. But that's actually not the point. The point here is that it sets a dangerous precedent for others, paving the way for proliferation of this highly sensitive technology. And this could really do damage to the already fragile consensus of the NPT at a critical point in its juncture. It also moves us in the opposite direction of the stated G7 goal, which is a commitment to minimise stockpiles of highly enriched uranium globally. And what's ironic here, this commitment is led by the UK, no less, that's now involved in this AUKUS deal. The other problem about using this technology is it could provide extra justification for the US to resume its own uranium enrichment, which it hasn't been doing since 1992, when the production of HEU for naval reactor fuel ended. And in fact, the US ended highly enriched uranium production for weapons back in 1964.
So what do you think AUKUS leaders can do to mitigate these fears that this deal could lead to another nuclear state in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, Australia says it wants to be transparent and will work with the IAEA accordingly, and that's great, and it should absolutely do that. There are some additional things, though, that it could do to provide assurances about its intentions if this, in fact, goes ahead. And one thing it could do is choose to use fuel for its subs that's less sensitive on the proliferation front. It could use low-enriched uranium rather than highly enriched uranium. And low-enriched uranium requires considerably more work to get it to that weapons grade level. And so it's less risky from a proliferation perspective. Now, the US uses 93% highly enriched uranium to fuel its naval reactors, and this is weapons grade. So while officials haven't said exactly what's going to be happening, and they have said that these details haven't yet been determined, it does really seem like a fair bet that HEU fuel would be likely for Australian submarines with US technological assistance. But not all naval reactors use HEU fuel or HEU fuel enriched to that level. Ironically, France uses low-enriched uranium for its naval reactors. So Australia could choose to use low-enriched uranium as a demonstration that it does not intend to divert the fuel for weapons use. And this could be an opportunity to bring France into the partnership, repairing relations as a sort of FAUKUS rather than AUKUS, as James Acton of the Carnegie Endowment has also suggested. So that's one thing it could do. And then a different thing, regardless of what type of nuclear fuel it uses, it could say it will forego enrichment capabilities, much as the UAE did in its nuclear cooperation agreement with the US. And this would mean that Australia wouldn't produce this material itself, it would need to get it from somewhere else. And this then lessens the concern that Australia would be able to divert HEU fuel for weapons purposes. Now, this could go some way to providing assurances that this technology sharing will not lead down a slippery slope to weapons capabilities that could be used if calculations change down the track. And some experts and non-proliferation organisations have suggested that Australia should sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think it's fairly unlikely to happen, but presumably this could go some way to sending positive signals and mitigate fears. Regardless of all of this, Australia and the US are going to need to really think about how this doesn't affect the strength of the non-proliferation regime. This is going to be really important as we look ahead to the review conference for the treaty that's coming up in February 2022.
Well, we're nearly out of time, but any final word?
Well, it's interesting here. The details really don't seem to be ironed out. It's definitely not a fait accompli. And this means that the expert community has a lot to offer in talking about the pros and cons of this and considerations as this process gets underway. So I think a lot of people listening on Press the Button today will have an opportunity to really weigh in and have their views known about whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea, or how to go about it in the future.
Thanks so much, Emma.
Join us Thursday, October 21 for Press the Button Live, Nuclear Policy in the Biden Administration and Beyond. 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, broadcasting live on Zoom. Every year, Plowshares Fund gathers partners in the nuclear policy community, members of Congress, and listeners like you who are eager to learn more about how we can reset nuclear policy and create a safer world for all. This year, we're adapting our annual Nuclear Policy Forum into our Press the Button podcast format for an inspiring and informative discussion. The virtual forum will be led by Plowshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Press the Button podcast co-hosts Tom Collina and Michelle Doak. Confirmed guests include Chairman Adam Smith of the House Armed Services Committee, California Congressman Ro Khanna, and many more to be announced. For more information and to register for this free event, visit plowshares.org.
Hi, my name is Chase Enright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, millennial, or member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues. Because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work, to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists, and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
To mark the 20th anniversary of the War on Terror, this podcast has looked back through the lens of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how those wars have impacted other U.S. policies such as on Iran and North Korea. Today, we are going to look at the human side of the equation, how the wars affected U.S. troops and their families. Most Americans simply don't see the impact of war on military families because we don't know anyone in the military, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself. So I reached out to Sarah Streyder, who is Executive Director of the Secure Families Initiative, which trains military spouses and family members to speak out and share their stories. Sarah lives in Virginia and was recognized as the AFI Quantico Spouse of the Year in 2020. And she also has a master's in public policy from Cambridge University. Sarah, it's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Tom.
So, Sarah, I think you would describe yourself as a proud military spouse. So let's start with that experience. What has it been like to be part of the military family over the last 20 years?
My spouse and I met in high school well before the military was in his sights. And then partway into college, he decided it was a career path he felt called to. And I still liked him. So I proposed, we got married, and a few months later, he enlisted. And over the course of the first 5 years of our marriage, we spent less than half of that time living in the same space because the military kept sending him far away from where I could find jobs in my field. Ironically, it actually wasn't until COVID that we've had our longest stint of living under the same roof, which is something I've been grateful for. I didn't grow up in a military family, so I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But, you know, I've been told from other military spouses who did grow up as military brats themselves that the post 9/11 military family experience is way different from even what they grew up with. Because the wartime ops tempo has been exhausting for them. As one commander that we've served under once put it, surge has become standard. So even folks who supposedly had a firsthand knowledge of what the military family lifestyle looked like, even they say that they didn't know what they were signing up for.
And, you know, just to put some numbers on it and how grueling the last 20 years have been, about 7,000 service members have died during military operations since September 11th. And not only that, suicide rates among active duty personnel have risen, and the numbers have reached in the neighborhood of 30,000, which of course is 4 times as many as the direct deaths in action. What is your sense of what is going on here? I mean, are these numbers greater than the general population? Is this something particular? Obviously, the military deaths are, but I'm more thinking about the suicide deaths. So is this something that is out of proportion in the military? What is your sense?
Thank you so much for raising what is an important but often overlooked issue. So yes, the Brown University's Costs of War project released a report about this issue recently. And yes, they found that these rates are higher than the civilian population. Researchers have found a whole number of contributing factor for this rate being so shockingly high, but the most prominent and for our sake relevant factors for us to focus on stem from the nature of modern warfare. So war is perpetual now. I know one Special Forces spouse whose loved one deployed 27 times over their 25 years of marriage. There's no break in that kind of setup. And many service members who deploy to conflict zones suffer from traumatic brain injuries or TBIs from IED attacks. And those can have lifelong physical and mental health implications. And even those who don't deploy to the front lines, but are still directly involved in targeting missions, for example, they experience trauma and moral injury as well. Our board president, Heather Aliano, recently wrote an article in Just Security about her own family's experience with just that. And then, of course, there's the issue of support services and whether we're raising to the task. Some troops still face a stigma at seeking out mental health resources, and some troops have been let down by the low quality resources they've been offered. So there's a whole ecosystem that is worth analyzing under this topic. And I will quickly note that much of the research on suicide rates in the military doesn't count military spouses and kids. Who also struggle with this problem. And that's an area that needs a lot more data because secondary trauma amongst military family members is a prevalent phenomenon. But the bottom line is this. When you hear about something like high suicide rates in the military or other tragic challenges facing our community, I want folks to understand the connection between those and the foreign policy decisions that exacerbated them, because it's not like these things are happening in a vacuum. And that is what I see as being an important missing piece.
If I could ask you just to expand on that a little more, how would you describe that connection?
Yeah, a lot of military support organizations focus on what I call the downstream consequences of US foreign policy. But it's important to also analyze the upstream factors. So when we make a choice, and by we, I mean both voters and policymakers alike, when we choose to prioritize investment and prioritize involvement of our military in involvement abroad, that puts us on this heightened tempo that falls on the shoulders of service members to carry out. And it has been that experience of the last 20 years ops tempo that has exacerbated many of the unique challenges that face the community. And so we can't keep putting Band-Aids on the problem by simply investing in DoD support services and hoping that it's all going to go away. We also have to take a critical eye at the upstream causes that make it harder and harder to solve these challenges.
I mentioned this at the top, but I wanted to talk about a little bit more, which is this, and maybe this is just me, but it seems like there's this growing isolation of the military community from the general public. And maybe you know the number of what percentage of U.S. citizens serve in the military. I've heard it's low, but what would you put it at?
So the statistics I'm familiar with are that 1% of Americans serve and about 7% of Americans identify as veteran status.
Right. So a very low number. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how this compares historically and why it's so low and what effect does this have on bringing attention to these issues?
Yeah, we have an all-volunteer force, and recruits for that all-volunteer force tend to come from the same concentrated communities within the U.S., even from the same families over multiple generations. Compare that to, say, the days of the draft, where military service was a more universal experience that touched almost every U.S. family in some way. So that's the difference. And I think there are two important upshots behind this difference. Number one, it makes our job as advocates harder. We see a large gap in understanding between the minority of Americans who serve and the majority of Americans who don't. And as a result, while it's not hard to find voters and leaders who want to pass policies that support the troops and their families, it's harder to find folks with a fluent understanding of what such supportive policies actually look like. I think too often military service is associated in our minds with foreign policy hawkishness, and that is the opposite of what most of us want. And so a lot of what SFI does is trying to educate the public on what our lived experiences are like. And I'll quickly plug, we recently produced and released a short video that kind of summarizes what the last 20 years have looked like on the home front. And that's part of the reason why we thought it was so important to take on such a project. But the second upshot, I think this community insulation is dangerous for recruitment and retention as well. The burden of the last 20 years has fallen on fewer and fewer shoulders. And I know of some families who are multi-generational military families, their dad, their grandpa, their grandma, you name it, served, who are finally deciding to not recommend the military service lifestyle to their kids because it's become too much. So if few people already serve, and if those people are leaving the pipeline, where will that leave us? That is one of the biggest reasons why policymakers need to listen to the urgency coming from military families who are tired in order to stem what could be a long-term retention problem.
Got it. Well, let's talk for a minute about how you and your organization, Secure Families Initiative, are seeking to change this situation and try to improve the situation of military families. So tell us more about what you're doing, what your priorities are, and how you're going about it.
Yeah. So we start from this place. Military families are direct stakeholders in national security and foreign policy decision. And so our overarching mission as SFI is to include our community's voices in those decision-making spaces. Sometimes we do that through broad education, and sometimes we have more directed policy advocacy. And we've chosen to focus on a few key pillars based on the issues that are most salient to our lived experiences. So our first pillar of focus is demilitarizing US foreign policy. This means winding down endless wars that have driven the post 9/11 operational tempo. It means repealing and reforming the outdated war authorizations that perpetuate them. And it means reanalyzing our spending, investing more in non-military tools like diplomacy and development that can prevent conflicts from ever arising, than, say, investing in legacy weapon systems that have more to do with which congressional districts they're in than actual safety. Our second pillar is actually demilitarizing law enforcement. That may seem like a bit of a non sequitur, but it's not. The lines have unfortunately blurred between the military and domestic law enforcement. And nowhere was that more apparent than in Lafayette Park in June of 2020. And that phenomenon, that trend has been really dangerous for the long-term health of the military's institution and military-civilian relations. So that's also an issue we get involved in. And finally, our third pillar, in order to have a voice in public policy decisions, our community of military families has to have, as a baseline, the ability to vote. And last year, we saw unprecedented political attacks against democratic institutions, including vote by mail, which military families rely on to cast our ballots when we're stationed far away from home. So voting rights and access has become increasingly necessary for us to engage on.
Fascinating, thank you. And if I could just pull a thread of on one of those issues, which is authorizations for military force. That's a big issue here in Washington right now, particularly as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over, yet the authorizations for those wars continue. And many have said that one of the reasons why these wars went on so long is because the authorizations were not time limited, right? They were open-ended. There was never a moment where a president had to go back to Congress and renew those authorizations. So I'm wondering, what is your view on the authorizations and what is your organization doing on that issue?
Yeah, we start from this baseline principle that if the president is going to send our loved ones into harm's way, that we deserve for those decisions to be as deliberative and transparent and constitutional as possible. And so from that principle, stems certain calls to action. So we advocate for the repeal of the 2002 Iraq War authorization. The primary reason we do so comes from a fear of presidents from either party using that as legal justification to draw our troops back into a protracted conflict, either in Iraq or specifically as it involves Iran. That would be in the exact opposite of military family interests to enter onto a warpath footing with Iran. And so that we see this outdated authorization as repealing it as a key component to that broader mission of avoiding war with Iran. And then, of course, there's the 60 words that have dominated the last 20 years, the 2001 authorization. And that, of course, is a much longer term project of finding political consensus on the Hill for what would be needed is some form of a replacement, and making sure that whatever new authorization Congress decides to pass, I think having time-bound components is one of the important requirements that we hold as an organization of what we would be looking for, sunset clauses, and also specificity, both geographically and in terms of which actors to engage. All of that is what would be necessary to result in the type of authorization that would give military families confidence that our country is engaging in these decisions in the most necessary of situations.
So now that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over for the U.S. anyway, do you expect things to get better for military families, or are there other challenges ahead? In other words, what are the challenges that you see going forward, including, are you worried about, for example, a new Cold War with China or other things that we might get involved with?
Yeah. I'm not convinced that our military's operational tempo is going to suddenly shrink on its own overnight. We still have troops deploying all the time to corners of the world that the general public is much less familiar with. So if anything, I am worried that the post 9/11 ops tempo is going to continue with even less public acknowledgement, because there's no titular war to focus attention on. I mean, gosh, the media spent more time talking about Afghanistan over the last 20 days than it did over the last 20 years. And that was a war the public knew about. So how do we expect things to get much better when deployments are to Syria and Somalia instead? So that's what makes our job as advocates just as important now as ever, to maintain information and education at a level that it deserves. And to your point, Tom, about a new Cold War setup, I mean, absolutely. The higher that tensions rise, even with a country like China or Russia, the riskier it becomes and the more of a knife's edge our families end up living on, because we never know when something is going to happen, either intentional or accidental, that is going to all of a sudden spur us into a full-on conflict footing that would be just devastating for our community. So we are absolutely cognizant and vigilant toward the decisions that our policymakers are making now in how they're going to set us up for the future.
Sarah, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for being here. I think your work is just tremendously important, and I really appreciate you coming here today to share with us what you're doing. And I wish you the best of luck in all your work.
Thanks, Tom. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's a privilege to be on the other side of the microphone now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco. Research by Desiree Cepetis and Harry Tarpey. Audio engineering and sound design by Michael Padilla and the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.